Westward ho! Let's explore the beginnings of the westward growth of our nation and look at the earliest transportation and infrastructure. Almost as soon as the 13 original colonies became the United States of America, the new nation found itself in the middle of a booming industrial revolution in the East, just as the settler rush began to claim farmlands further to the west. There was a lot going on, but all of the opportunities for economic growth and self-sufficiency made it clear that big improvements were needed to move people and goods. Before 1800, most of the United States was east of the Appalachian Mountains. The main forms of transportation were boats, horseback, or if you couldn't afford a boat or horse, you could always walk. The first roads were primitive trails that were widened to accommodate wagons. Improvements to primitive roads through swamps and mud were made using logs laid side by side. They were known as corduroy roads because the lines of logs looked like corduroy cloth. It was a terrible ride, but at least wagons didn't become stranded. Some private companies built sophisticated roads on beds of gravel to improve drainage. The gravel was then covered with stones for a smoother ride. Because these were expensive to construct, the builders would charge a toll from travelers using them. One new road west, the National Road, was built with funds approved by Congress. It first brought Maryland travelers to Wheeling in western Virginia, and after further improvements, it was lengthened to reach Illinois. For many years, this was a major road for hauling freight and transporting settlers west. Some settlers and freight haulers made use of river transportation, which was less expensive, but much slower. As more settlers moved into Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, it became necessary to improve water transportation. But technology caught up with water travel due to the introduction of steamboats. Steamboats revolutionized travel throughout the West. Along with passengers, it was now possible for farmers and merchants to move goods huge distances, cheaply and quickly, on the Mississippi, Missouri, and Ohio rivers. Another major improvement occurred in the early 1800s as canals were dug to create shortcuts from one waterway to another. These vital economic links helped farmers get their crops to eastern markets more quickly. Eventually, the Erie Canal would connect the Great Lakes region to markets in New York City. Improvements in transportation in the first half of the 1800s helped make it easier to move people and goods in the expanding nation. How might a country improve its transportation if it was expanding into new territory today?
Lesson 4. Westward Movement. English colonists began moving west almost as soon as they arrived in America in the 1600s. Westward expansion quickly became a tradition that helped define the nation. Get ready to read. Start up. Examine this painting of wagons heading west. What might have gone through people's minds as they looked toward the wilderness before them? Guiding questions. What did the frontier mean to the nation in the first half of the 19th century? How did the westward movement change family life? How did geography affect life in the West? Vocabulary. Revenue. Flatboat. Claremont. Erie Canal. National Road. Academic vocabulary. Extend. Despite. Why did Americans move west? As the population of the United States grew, land became more expensive, and some Americans began to feel crowded. By the early 1800s, the promise of new farmland and other work opportunities brought a flood of new emigrants from settled areas in the east to the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Territory was the area north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi. Colonists had been moving into this area since before the American Revolution. When the United States acquired this land from the United Kingdom, the flow of settlers increased. One of the first tasks of the new federal government was to organize how the territory was to be settled. In a series of 3 acts, passed between 1784 and 1787, Congress created the Northwest Ordinance. It applied specifically to the Northwest Territory at first. Later, the principles of the ordinance were extended to other territories. The ordinance allowed individuals to buy land in 640-acre tracts. That much acreage was too expensive for most settlers. Soon, developers were buying land and dividing it into smaller parcels that were more affordable and more manageable. The sale of land attracted settlers, but it also provided needed revenue or income for the U.S. government. The money was needed to pay off debt from the American Revolution. In the past, people thought of territories as colonies. The ordinance changed that. Settlers in these territories could now organize into states that would have all the rights of the original 13 states. People moving into the territories were not leaving the United States, they were expanding it. Another part of the ordinance outlawed slavery in the territories. This provision would cause many sectional disputes. Opportunities and challenges. Americans moved west for many reasons, but mostly they wanted the opportunity to own land, start businesses, and build new lives. Some people, like the Mormons, moved west to find religious freedom. In 1803, President Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase from France, doubling the size of the country. The Louisiana Purchase opened up a vast new territory with many valuable natural resources. Some of the first people moving into the new territories were fur trappers. Beaver fur, in particular, was in high demand in the East and in Europe. Many of the trails forged by trappers were later used by settlers moving west. Reading check. Summarize. In what ways did the Northwest Ordinance encourage settlement of the West?
Okay, here's a picture of a flat boat. As you can see, it's a flat bottom boat. It's a big raft, and people can't put that much stuff on these boats. Here it says they've got no motor. The only power is what the water does, or a little bit of manpower. Rowing. Here's a road. Here's a place where somebody's paying another person to use the road. That's a toll. Here's one of those corduroy roads they're talking about where they're using logs to get through the woods.
Heading into the West. When the United States formed its first government, it already controlled most of the land east of the Mississippi River. There was ample land for settlers. Very quickly, though, the United States acquired more territory and expanded westward. Expanded territories. Not all the new territories were gained by treaty. In 1818, the U.S. Army, led by General Andrew Jackson, invaded Florida. His action led to Spain's surrender of that territory. In the 1840s, the United States acquired the Oregon Territory in a settlement with Britain that narrowly avoided a war. Victory in the Mexican-American War added lands in the Southwest and California. In less than 50 years, the United States expanded all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Following the rivers. People wanted to settle these territories, but few easy routes led west. The best routes were often rivers. Many people moving to the Northwest Territory traveled west along the Mohawk River and then sailed across Lake Erie. Others crossed the Appalachians to Pittsburgh. There they loaded their animals and wagons onto flatboats, or flat-bottomed boats, and floated down the Ohio River. As settlers journeyed west of the Mississippi, the rivers continued to play a key role. Lewis and Clark followed the Missouri River as they explored the Louisiana Purchase. Long sections of the Missouri are fast and unpredictable, so few settlers used it for transportation. The Platte River in Nebraska was too shallow for shipping, but it was a reliable source of water in a dry region. Traders, settlers, and the U.S. Army built forts and settlements along the river. Settlers stocked up on supplies at these outposts as they traveled across the West. the American system. As the country expanded, Americans sought ways to develop the economy. Henry Clay promoted a plan known as the American system. It was a government policy to benefit agriculture, merchants, and industry. The American system had three main parts. First, tariffs would protect industry. Second, a national bank would make loans to promote business growth. Third, the tariffs and the sale of public lands would provide funds for the building of roads, canals, and other improvements. These transportation improvements would help farmers and manufacturers get their products to market. Finally, money from the payment of tariffs plus money from selling public lands would help pay for improvements. Technology speeds transportation. Despite its advantages, river travel presented problems. Moving upstream, for instance, was difficult. Technology, however, soon made travel faster and cheaper. In 1807, Robert Fulton launched a steamboat, the Clermont, on the Hudson River. Soon, steamboats plied the Ohio, Mississippi, and Missouri rivers. They carried passengers and gave farmers and merchants a cheap way to move goods. Another improvement was the Erie Canal. New York Governor DeWitt Clinton pushed for approval of this project. The legislature approved $7 million for the canal to link the Great Lakes to the Mohawk and Hudson rivers. The canal enabled timber and other goods to be shipped by barge from the Northwest Territory to New York Harbor. Soon, other states, as well as private investors, were building canals that helped connect western farms and eastern cities. The National Road. Settlers faced difficult journeys when traveling west by land. Many roads were narrow dirt trails. They often plunged through muddy swamps. Tree stumps stuck up in the roads and broke wagon axles. The nation badly needed better roads. Thomas Jefferson and others supported construction of a national road paid for by the government. Critics argued that the project was unconstitutional, as road building is not an expressed power. Nevertheless, in 1806, Congress approved funds for the first national road building project. By 1818, the national road ran from Cumberland, Maryland, to the Ohio River at Wheeling, Virginia. Later, the road was extended into Illinois. As each new section of road was built, settlers eagerly drove their wagons farther and farther west. Reading check. Compare and contrast. How was the landscape both an advantage and a disadvantage to settlers moving west?
Okay, let's see. These are the different parts of the steamboat. Pilot house. Somebody actually has to steer. Don't just depend on the river to take you somewhere. These boats had pilots. The boiler. This is how it's powered. As you can see here, water gets pulled up. It gets boiled, and that creates pressure, which moves all the parts. And then the steam goes up here, out the top. Okay. Paddle. Here's all the parts moving. What powers the boat? This big paddle. Usually the paddles are in the back, or I don't know if you can see it here. It's in a case here. Cargo. Okay, you can put lots of stuff there. Got it. What you need to know, this boat uses the water, boils it. The boiling water creates pressure, moving the crank, and that lets the boat go up and down the river. Okay, Erie Canal. Okay, locks. Ooh, I was wondering about this. Canal locks. You should have learned about this last year. China created these to get things to go uphill. Load water into one space. When the boat is in that space, then you open up another lock and it moves down the river. And when you get to another uphill, they fill in more water and pretty interesting stuff. What else is there? Aqueducts. Okay, don't know about that. This says the same thing as before. It was a very big project, cost $7 million. As you can see, lots of people are working on this canal project. One way to power the boats before is to stay by the side of the river and let a horse drag you. This is the same thing that I said before.
Movement changes the West and the nation. Settling the West was a challenge for even the hardiest people. Settlers traveled long distances over rugged land for weeks or months. They lived outdoors in all kinds of weather. Sickness, hunger, and thirst were common. They confronted hostile American Indians, although few armed conflicts occurred. Settlers build new lives. When settlers finally arrived at their destination, the real work began. They found land that had never been plowed and was grown thick with trees, bushes, and dense grasses. The land was rich in natural resources, but it required extensive labor to use and develop them. Settlers created farms and built businesses and towns from the ground up. Life in the West changed traditional roles for men and women. Women's roles were as necessary as those of men, and the two often overlapped. Few farms were run by a single man. It took two people to succeed, usually a husband and wife. Wives didn't just run the household as they had back east. They worked alongside their husbands at all sorts of jobs. They helped plant and harvest crops and care for livestock, as well as making clothing and household tools and furnishings. Children had chores too. Everyone had to work hard to make and maintain a home on this new land. It is not surprising that the lifestyle that developed in the West was somewhat different from that of the East. Women enjoyed greater equality in the West, and overall, there were fewer class distinctions. Most people were respected for their actions and their character, rather than for who they were or how much money they had. Westerners also had a high regard for democracy. Changing the country. By the early 1800s, Americans had settled many of the lands east of the Mississippi. By 1830, almost as many people lived west of the Appalachians as had lived in all of the United States in 1783. In the years that followed, the flood of people moved farther west to such places as Oregon, Texas, and California. The result was a rapid shift in population westward. As people moved westward, so did the frontier. Historian Frederick Turner described the frontier as the outer edge of the wave, the meeting point between savagery and civilization. At each stage in westward movement, settlers learned how to survive in their new environment and how to use the available natural resources. They learned how to trade and cooperate with the American Indians and how to exploit and overcome them. They formed governments and disputed the slavery question. In these processes, they remade America. While settlers were moving into the West, the rest of the country was still dealing with economic challenges and political disagreements. As you will read, sectional conflicts brewed through the first half of the 19th century as differences grew between the North and the South. Reading check. Draw conclusions. Why did women experience greater equality in the West than in the East?